You can convert to Judaism. You can't convert to a blood family. You cannot convert to a race. Judaism is a religion. That's all it is. Judaism is a religion. That's all it is. Judaism is a religion. That's all it is. Jewish identities have evolved in different directions, and that's what's causing the confusion today. A little history is in order. History of Zionism in Israel. They call themselves the Jewish state. What exactly is a Jewish state? Now, normally, the way states are created, the way people are created, let's say this country, United States of America, we were here in the colonies and we wanted to break off from the British, and those people who were here became the citizens of the United States. But that's clearly not what happened in Israel. In Israel, you're talking about a case, a strange case, a historical anomaly, where the people had to come into a land. The people existed before the land. Now, you have nationalities without lands, let's say the Kurds, for example. But there you're talking about people who, according to the Zionists, existed first, and then they came into some land. And somehow that land became the Jewish state.
Moshe Gessen describes one of two Jewish states created in the world. The Jewish state that you know about is Israel. The one you probably haven't heard of, the one that Gessen writes about, is called Birobidzhan. It was created after the Bolshevik Revolution as a Jewish autonomous region. Jews who moved there had hoped to create a place of safety where Jewish culture and the Yiddish language could thrive. That's not how it worked out. The history of Birobidzhan is told in Gessen's new book, Where the Jews Aren't. She is a journalist who's also written books about Vladimir Putin, the Russian punk band Pussy Riot, and the Tsarnaev brothers who bombed the Boston Marathon. Gessen grew up in the Soviet Union, deprived of many rights because she's Jewish. She emigrated with her family to the U.S. in 1981 when she was 14. As a journalist, she returned to Moscow, but she had to flee a second time to avoid a law that would have enabled the government to take away her adopted son because she's a lesbian. Moshe Gessen, welcome back to Fresh Air. So just give us the basic outline of what was Birobidzhan.
So Birobidzhan was, and actually still is, nominally one of the two Jewish states in the world. The other one obviously being Israel. But Birobidzhan was formed earlier. It was part of a Soviet experiment. The Soviet Union initially conceived itself as a sort of anti-imperial empire in which every nation had the right to self-determination and to some sort of autonomy. And the Jews who had, before the revolution, lived in the Pale of Settlement and had very limited civil rights, were supposed to be emancipated to be like other nations and therefore had to get an autonomy of their own. And so from the Soviet point of view, it was an attempt to make Jews like other ethnic groups living in the Soviet Union. And so they're granted a piece of land on the Soviet-Chinese border, an impossible sort of piece of land to inhabit and to cultivate. But tens of thousands of Jews moved there at certain times before World War II and then after World War II.
How did Zionism start? The Zionists created Zionism in order to solve a problem. What was the problem? Common Currency says the problem was anti-Semitism. Well, that's not true. The Zionists did believe that Zionism would end anti-Semitism, not because, like you'll hear people today say, well, the Zionists wanted the Jews to have an army so they can defend themselves. You will not find such an idea anywhere in early Zionist writings, anywhere. That was political propaganda that developed much, much later. In fact, Max Nordau, Herzl's lieutenant, said that it is not true. He made a protest against those people that think, in those days, that the purpose of Zionism was a response to anti-Semitism. And I quote, I have him right here. "It is not correct to say that Zionism is a gesture of truculence or an act of desperation against anti-Semitism. The effect of anti-Semitism was only to force them to reflect upon their relation to the nations of the world. And that reflection led them to conclusions which would endure in their minds and hearts even if anti-Semitism were to disappear completely. Anti-Semitism taught the Zionists something about themselves. that even without anti-Semitism, if anti-Semitism would disappear off the face of the earth, they would still have created Zionism. Anti-Semitism taught them something that wanted them to become Zionists. It taught them about a problem in the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was not the problem in and of itself. What was? Well, we spoke before about anti-Semites. Which anti-Semite do you think said the following? The Jewish people are a very nasty people. Its neighbors hate it, and they're right. Its end will be a Bartholomew night. They'll all be massacred. Now, Holocaust deniers are bad, but a Holocaust justifier is worse. The Jewish people is a very nasty people. Its neighbors hate it, and they're right. Its end will be a Bartholomew night. Vladimir Jabotinsky. If the tables were turned, another one says, and others were like the Jews, wouldn't we have good cause to hate them as well? Yosef Chaim Brenner, another one of the original Zionists. How about this one? Those loathsome Jews are vomited out by any healthy collective and state, not because they're Jews, but because of their Jewish repulsiveness. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, another one of the early Zionists. The Zionists were secular Jews who absorbed the attitudes of the anti-Semites and looked at the Jews themselves with the same disgust and loathing that the anti-Semites did. I'm going to give you two quotes said by two different people. Take a guess who said them. They're almost the same. Quote number one. The Jews describe the religious Jews. Sterile Jewish masses living parasitically off the body of an alien economic body. I know it's a little redundant, but you got to bear with the guy. Quote number two. Never a nomad, but only and always a parasite in the body of other peoples. Also about the Jews. Who do you think said these things? Well, quote number two was Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, chapter 11. Quote number one was David Ben-Gurion, Mimamad La'am, page 269. The Zionists' problem was that they learned from the anti-Semites how disgusting the Jews were. And the reason the Jews were disgusting was because they looked like me, and they acted like me. And they blamed me, the religious Jews, for anti-Semitism. What did they hate about us? I'll come back to what Gilad said. Gilad mentioned, and he said I disagree, and I will, about problematic statements in the Bible and the Talmud, racist statements, militaristic statements, statements about killing races and people like that. I'll tell you something about the Talmud and the Bible. Everyone knows that Orthodox Jews don't merely follow the Bible, we also follow the Talmud, but not only the Talmud, it's the entire body of rabbinic literature. Here's how this works. The verses of the Bible and the pages in the Talmud are kind of like ingredients in a recipe. Taking a statement out of the Bible and saying, well, God told Joshua to kill the inhabitants of Canaan is kind of like saying, look at this recipe, it has vinegar in it, and guessing from the ingredient what the final outcome will be. The verses in the Bible and the pages of the Talmud are ingredients. The oral law is, to us, an instruction, how to put the ingredients together, how to cook them. And different rabbis are better skilled at it than others. Some come out with the most beautiful culinary masterpieces, and some just can bake a, Betty Crocker cake. Duncan Hines. So there are different levels of rabbis, different levels of creativity. But the oral Torah to us, our Torah, is basically a method of taking the Bible and taking the Talmud and coming out with a final recipe. What's the final recipe? Well, we have those verses that Gilad referred to. We also have a verse where God told King David that he's disqualified from building our temple because he was a warrior. We have verses in the Talmud that say when the Jews are in exile, we are not allowed to wage wars against the nations, even when the nations attack us. We're supposed to run, and we did run. And the Zionists hated us for this. They hated us for not being militaristic. They hated us for not being like them. They hated us for being meek, and they hated us for running, and they hated us for not defending ourselves. We will not. Throughout our exile, God said to us That's part of your punishment and part of the way we keep you safe. You do not wage war. You do not kill other people. Collectively, you don't. There's one exception. One exception. If anybody dares attack our religion, not us, you attack us, we'll run. You attack our religion. You try to get us to convert. Then, in horror, will we rise up against our enemies. Not as warriors, not as attackers, but with the same emotion that even the most pacifist mother would have. When a band of kidnappers come to take away her children, she'll grab a kitchen knife if necessary, and with no regard for her personal safety, she will attack. With that same emotion, with love for our God and our religion, without any regard for our safety, we will rise up like a lioness to protect what is most valuable to us and what we love the most in the world. And if God wants us to die like that mother, it's not our safety that we were worried about. We were trained to do that. The Zionists created Zionism to extinguish Jewishness from the Jew. They wanted a militaristic Jew. They were ashamed of the way the Jews acted. They were shamed in the face of the anti-Semites and in the face of the world. They thought that the reason the anti-Semites hate the Jews is because they act like we do. Jews were not interested in culture or art, they were interested in Torah. There was no such thing as Jewish art, there's no such thing as Jewish sports. You go through the whole Talmud, you won't find any reference to sports, and I'll tell you something about the language Yiddish. In Yiddish, there are no idioms that make reference to military expressions or physical strength expression. In English, we say a guy, he hit below the belt, he's behind the 8 ball, oh, he hit a home run. In Yiddish, Yankees slaughtered the Mets. You will not find any such idioms in Yiddish because Yiddish is a reflection of our lifestyle, not our culture. There's no culture. We had our values. The Zionists hated our values, and they were ashamed of it. So they created Zionism to destroy our values. How did they want to destroy our values? Here's what they did. In the day that the Zionists came about, the early days of Zionism, nationalism was sweeping throughout Europe. They took nationalism and said, you know what? Everybody's becoming a nation, and it's so great for them. Let's become a nation too. And if we become a nation, guess what's going to be? We won't look at ourselves as a religion. We'll look at ourselves as a nation. For example, let's say I wanted to tell the Christians that they shouldn't practice Christianity anymore. Well, I could try to convince them not to practice Christianity. And the Zionists wanted the Jews not to practice and believe in Judaism. But that probably won't work. So what I'll do instead is this. I'll tell all the Christians that Christianity is not a religion, it's really a baseball team. Jesus was the manager, and all the Gospels were all-stars. And this crazy idea that Christianity is a religion was made up by priests and stuff in exile because they got messed up in the head. But really, Christianity is a baseball team. I'm going to get a stadium, and I'm going to make uniforms, pinstripes that says Christians over it. I'm going to get them bats and balls to play so they can play in the Major League of Nations. And I'm going to convince them that if you really want to be a good Christian, learn how to play ball. Forget about this religious stuff. Learn how to play ball. That's what the Zionists did, except instead of a baseball team, they went to try to convince the Jews that the Jewish people are a nation, like France and like Spain. We'll get a land, that's Israel, that's our stadium. We'll get baseball bats and balls, we'll create a language. They sat down to create a language because nations need languages. They sat down to create a language because nations need languages. They sat down to create a language. They sat down to create a language. They sat down to create a language.
And for a few years, very briefly, the official language of this region was Yiddish. So it's probably the only Yiddish-speaking state that has ever existed.
And, you know, I think some of the attraction of the idea of Birobidzhan to Soviet Jews was that it would be a place where Yiddish would be the language because, as you say, Hebrew was the language in Israel. And there was a lot of fear that Yiddish was dying out, and that fear has been absolutely proven to be true. Yiddish is hardly a functioning language in the world anymore. So that was also really appealing.
Oh, absolutely. And Yiddish, it's fascinating what's happened to Yiddish over the course of the 20th century. And obviously the fact that 6 million Jews, many of whom were Yiddish-speaking, were killed in the Holocaust contributed to the death of the language. So it's not at the time that people were discussing Birobidzhan and the threat to Yiddish, that nobody could have conceived of that. And that's, that's another thing that interested me in the story of Birobidzhan, was that this whole discussion was happening on the eve of a catastrophe that no one could have imagined. And how we understand it is colored by this catastrophe. But getting back to the subject of Yiddish, there were a number of Yiddish language writers in what was then the Soviet Union who were very interested in Birobidzhan for that specific reason, because Yiddish in their minds had sort of evolved very quickly from a purely spoken language, sort of the household language of the Jews in diaspora, to a literary language, to a language of culture. And it was, at the time, it was a very progressive movement. And there was a lot of interesting experimentation happening in Yiddish literature precisely because it was such a revolutionary act to start writing and creating literature in a language that had been perceived as sort of the language of the household. I mean, my own great-grandmother always referred to Yiddish as the jargon. She was a literary woman. She had grown up speaking Yiddish. But to her, it wasn't a language of literature. It wasn't a language of culture. So that idea in itself was, it sort of was synergetic with the whole pathos of the Bolshevik Revolution and this idea of creating culture out of things that had been disregarded before.
So Birobidzhan was granted the status of Jewish Autonomous Region in 1934, and a resolution declared, for the first time in the history of the Jewish people, its burning desires for a homeland, for the achievement of its own national statehood, has been fulfilled. So this is 1934.
Let me show you what Oxford, let's see what they say about this so-called modern Hebrew. For more than 1,700 years thereafter, Hebrew was comatose, either a sleeping beauty or walking dead. It served as a liturgical and literary language, and occasionally also as a lingua franca for Jews of the diaspora, but not as a mother tongue. The formation of Israeli, notice what it says, the formation of Israeli, the name I use for so-called modern Hebrew. So you see this Oxford scholar calling the so-called modern Hebrew Israeli. It says was facilitated at the end of the 19th century by Eliezer ben Yehuda, I mentioned him earlier, school teachers and others to further the Zionist cause. So he's sharing that the language that you are hearing being called Hebrew, and they use this to influence what is supposedly be called biblical Hebrew, is all politics to further the Zionist cause. Earlier during the Haskalah, in other words, Enlightenment period of the 1770s through the 1880s, writers such as Mendele Mokhtar Safarim produced works in neologisms, which eventually contributed to Israeli. However, it was not until the beginning of the 20th century, notice what it says, it was not until the beginning of the 20th century that the language was first spoken. As a result of distinctive characters, such as the lack of a continuous chain of native speakers from Hebrew to Israeli, Israelis present the linguist with a unique laboratory experimenting in which to test a wider set of theoretical problems concerning language genesis and evolution. Indeed, the genetic classification of Israeli has preoccupied linguists from the beginning of the 20th century. The still prevalent traditional view suggests that Israeli is Semitic, in other words, Hebrew revived. Educators, scholars, and politicians have contributed to this assumption in their efforts to impose a nationalist narrative on linguistic reality. Revisionists counter that it is actually Indo-European Yiddish relexified, that is, Yiddish with Hebrew vocabulary. Come on, family. Am I not giving you sources? Israeli is a hybrid language, both Semitic and Indo-European. I argue that both Hebrew and Yiddish act equally as its primary contributors, accompanied by a plethora of other contributors such as Polish, Russian, German, Judeo-Spanish, in other words, Ladino, Arabic, English, and etc. These are all the contributions to what is being called modern Hebrew. Thus, the term Israeli is far more appropriate than Israeli Hebrew, let alone modern Hebrew or Hebrew to court. Yet closer scrutiny challenges this perception. The victorious Hebrew may, after all, be partly Yiddish at heart. In other words, the foundation of it, what you hear today, is Yiddish. In other words, Yiddish survives beneath Israeli phonetics, phonology, syntax, lexis, and even morphology. Although traditional and institutional linguists have been reluctant to admit it. They know this is not ancient Hebrew, not even close to it. But they don't want to admit it. That's what he's saying here. Although traditional and institutional linguists have been reluctant to admit it.
They sat down to create a language because nations need languages. And we will try to convince the Jewish people, forget about this religion stuff, it's nationality. Support Israel, fight in the army, then you're a good Jew. That way, we will be real men. We will be purified of our Jewiness. We will be purified of our Jewiness.
Of our Jewiness.
Of our Jewiness. Of our Jewiness.
So let's go back to the forward. Can 23andMe tell us if Jews are a race? And is that a good thing? It reads, the idea of race has historically slotted humans into a handful of categories: Asian, African, white, etc. But research has shown that there can be as much genetic differences within these races as between them. And experts say the notion that one skin tone and facial features alone can predict social behavior is plain wrong. It's really important for all of us to resist the attempt to revive this discredited notion that race is a biological category rather than a political and social category, said Marcy Darnovsky, director of the Center for Genetics and Society, a not-for-profit scientific ethics group. Now, these are some of the examples that this article posted of Ashkenazi Jews who used 23andMe to confirm their ethnicity, to confirm what race they belong to. This is a post by Jonathan Paul. Mine came back and basically told me I am extremely white, minus a bit of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, which is kind of dope because Gal Gadot, and that's the actress who played Wonder Woman. And here's another example they used by Abigail Jaffe. It says, I am 98% Ashkenazi, says 23andMe, and 99.7% European. That is white. And someone responded to her from within the Ashkenazi community, posted this: I am Ashkenazi Jew, and I'm most definitely not a person of color. Never thought I'd have to clear that up, but then they post a link to blogs.timesofisrael.com, which is another Jewish publication. This article made an attempt to say that the Ashkenazi Jewish community, they are a people of color. And then they highlighted actors and actresses and famous people from within that community. They photoshopped, in other words, they toned down their appearance to make them appear to be people of color. I'll post a link inside the description box. So again, resist the attempt to revive this discredited notion that race is a biological category rather than a political and social category. So let's skip down to another part of this article. It reads, Ashkenazic Jews often find themselves in the peculiar situation of being 90% Ashkenazi Jewish and 99% European. Sephardic Jews may be told they are mostly Middle Eastern and North African and less than 10% Ashkenazic. Stuart Schaufman, a travel writer and blogger who writes under the name, and I'm not going to pronounce the full name because of the vulgarity, but Broke Blank Stewart, said he brought a kid from 23andMe because even though his family insists they're exclusively Jewish, he thought there was a possibility that he has some non-Jewish ancestry. I was curious because you never know, said Schaufman. Family stories are just stories. Schaufman, who learned that he is 99.8% Ashkenazi Jewish said the test hasn't made much of a difference on his sense of Jewish identity. Judaism really informed who I am and my values and my worldview, Schaufman said. 23andMe hasn't made me more or less Jewy at all. I'm just Jewy.
Just like my last name Brown doesn't refer to the color of my skin. Just like my last name Brown doesn't refer to the color of my skin.
Just like my last name Brown doesn't refer to the color of my skin.
Michael Brown, I am Caucasian.
I am Caucasian.
I am Caucasian.
They sat down to create a language because nations need languages. And we will try to convince the Jewish people, forget about this religion stuff, it's nationality. Support Israel, fight in the army, then you're a good Jew. That way, we will be real men, we will be purified of our Jewiness. That's another cat, there's Jewishness, Judaism, there's Jewiness. And that's what the Zionists hated. And they figured anti-Semitism would end because if you're just like a regular guy, why in the world would they hate you? They wanted to end anti-Semitism by ending Semitism. Then there'll be nothing to oppose. It was the Jewish character that they wanted to destroy, and to a large extent they succeeded. There are some Jews that think that they're great Jews, even though they have nothing to do with the Jewish religion. Could be great people, but a great Jew, Judaism is a religion. There are other Jews that are religious, but they think it's good for Jews to be strong and to be masculine and to be powerful. That is the result of Zionism. It's the character that they changed. I'm going to end with one quote from Vladimir Jabotinsky again. The starting point of Zionism is to take a Yid and to imagine his diametrical opposite. Because a Yid is ugly, we're going to instill the Hebrew, that's what they used to call themselves, with masculine beauty. Because a Yid is weak, we're going to give the Hebrew strength. Because a Yid is ashamed, we're going to give the Hebrew pride. That was their goal, to create people that are the opposite of me. The existence of a Jewish state is an attack on my religion, its existence. What is a Jewish state? Avigdor Lieberman, in Israel's website, he said, what Italy is to the Italians and France is to the French, Israel is to the Jewish people. No. Judaism is a religion. Italy created the Italian people and France created the French. Israel did not create the Jewish people.
What's your thoughts? Please be respectful with your comments. Also, please click the like, click the notification bell, and subscribe to this channel.
Listen, Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 explains the genealogy of Shem. Shem was a black man in Africa. If you repeat this back, Genesis 14 verse 13, Abraham steps on the scene. Being a descendant of Shem, which is a fact, means Abraham too was black. Abraham, born in the city of a black man, called Nimrod, grandson of Ham. Ham had 4 sons. One was named Canaan. Here, let me do some explaining. Abraham, Isaac was the... Jacob had 12 sons, for real, and these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10.